If you guys are playing this upcoming format, there's a couple of things you need to know. So we already know that Crossover Breakers is coming out in a couple of weeks, and this set is absolutely crazy. It's revolutionary in terms of power creep. We're getting Malice as well as Yugioh, two decks that are actually going to be insanely good, at least for the foreseeable future. Personally, I'm fully expecting both of these decks to entirely power creep the metagame. So existing decks that we have like Snake Eyes Fire King, Pure Snake Eyes, Yugioh, Tenpai, all of these decks are just going to get left in the dust. They'll still be playable, don't get me wrong, but the thing is Yugioh and Malice are just really, really good. So, as you guys know, Yugioh is a rank 4 base deck. It's a lot like Sprites and Zodiacs. It's a control-heavy deck. All of their monsters search for themselves, and then you overlay into a bunch of powerful rank 4s. Whereas Malice is a cyberspace strategy that spams the board with a bunch of bodies, and then link climbs into the existing generic powerful cybers links that we have on the table, like Firewall Dragon, Terahertz. This deck also heavily relies on banishing cards, and then when they're banished, you get some kind of effect to summon them back, so you can easily flood the board with a bunch of different Dotscaper-esque effects. So for the past week or so, I've been playing around with both of these decks just to see like how they function, as well as analyzing the OCG to see exactly what they're playing and adapting for over there. Here are a couple of things that I found out. So first and foremost, we all know that Malice is heavily banish reliant, which is why Artifact LANCEA is basically being cited in every single deck over in the OCG. This is a very powerful lingering effect that places a condition where neither player can banish cards during the turn that you discard this card from your hand to the graveyard. It can obviously only be used during your opponent's turn, unfortunately, so you can't stop things like Dimensional Shifter, but it's very, very powerful against Malice because you can shotgun this, and then they can't activate basically anything because all of their effects are reliant on banishing. At the same time, you're stopping other banishing effects, cards like Allure of Darkness, potentially the pot cards as well. You can even stop things like Evenly Matched in the right circumstances, so this is a card that I think everyone's going to be siding. But the issue is when everyone sides a certain card, it means that the rest of the world's going to anticipate it, so everyone's going to find counter strategies to the popular card that you're siding. So everyone's going to be trying to play in a way to beat LANCEA. I'm sure that CROSSOUT Designator is going to be absolutely everywhere calling LANCEA in the Malice deck just because of how high impact this card is, which is why I actually discovered there's another card that's equally as good, potentially maybe even better than LANCEA, and that's none other than Chaos Hunter. So Chaos Hunter is a card that has a lingering condition, which also says your opponent cannot banish any cards, and you can special summon this out of your hand by discarding a card when your opponent special summons any monster. Now, this card has seen some heavy play in the past formats when there were heavy banish-reliant strategies, and I think Malice is no different. The fact that this card actually cannot easily be crossed out or called by interacted with, especially when no one's really expecting it. Like, people are already siding in LANCEA with CROSSOUT, but no one's going to side in Chaos Hunter to try and counter, you know, like this obscure card, right? So chances are this card's going to resolve. Like, obviously there are cards like Dominus Impulse, which certain Malice strategies might incorporate to stop this card from being summoned out, but then you have to realize that this card's actually not once per turn. So yes, you discard a card for the cost for the initial activation, but they chain with Dominus, so you're kind of trading that card that you discarded with the Dominus. So then if they summon again, you can actually bring out the Chaos Hunter again. It's not once per turn. You can keep doing it every time they summon a monster. Obviously, this card being a 2500 beater is also very relevant, but the other thing is this is a lingering effect that only imposes a condition on your opponent. So you can still banish cards, but your opponent cannot. This doesn't only last for one single turn, unlike LANCEA. When you draw your card for turn, you're still going to have Chaos Hunter on your field, because as far as I'm aware, Malice does not have any inherent ways to actually get rid of this. All of their cards in their main deck and the extra deck actually rely on banishing to remove a card from the field, which means Chaos Hunter is likely going to be safe, and as far as I'm aware, they don't play Forbidden Droplet because they already play Shifter, which brings me to my next point. This card actually stops Shifter, because if it's on your field during your turn, even if they shifted you, cards are not going to be able to be banished. So during your turn, you're actually nullifying Dimensional Shifter. Some Malice decks are also incorporating Floodgates like Macrocosmos, so this turns that off, and it also turns off Bystials. Like, even in some rogue matchups against like Centurion, Bystials, Runic, Kashtira, this really stops all those decks in their tracks, because it just says you can't banish, period. And I know this card comes in QCR. It's pretty cheap right now, but people are starting to catch on, so I don't know, maybe check out your local store if you can pick some up. So speaking of Malice, there's actually a neat little interaction that we have to talk about, and that's the fact that all 3 of the Malice traps actually can be activated during the turn they're set by banishing a Malice monster you control. Now, because this is a cost, what happens is a Malice player can actually set this in their back row, normal summon one of their monsters like the rabbit, use the effect, and then when your opponent tries to effect Failure or Infinite Impermanence on that monster, you can chain this trap to banish your monster as a cost, so the target's no longer there and you resolve the effect, which is kind of neat. It's like a built-in CROSSOUT Designator / called by. But this got me thinking that, you know, as a Malice player, you can actually bluff having one of these traps by setting basically any spell or trap card in your hand and then normal summoning the monster. So this might make your opponent second guess whether or not they want to Imperm or Valor, because you might actually actually have a Malice trap in your back row. Now, at the same time, there's kind of a mind game. Like, you can bluff your opponent as a Malice player, just setting cards, or you can call a Malice player's bluff. If they're setting cards to their back row, what if they're just trying to bluff you out and they don't have a Malice trap? Well, you might still want to Imperm or Veiler. So that's, I think, a recurring thing in this format, is deciding whether or not your opponent is trying to bluff you by setting a Malice trap, or if they're actually just setting a regular spell or trap and trying to make it so you don't Veiler or Imperm. Definitely a neat little mind game in that scenario. So we kind of touched upon it before, but Crossout Designator is a really, really powerful card in this format. Number one, being able to stop the high impact cards that are keeping these two decks in check. So Dimensional Barrier is shutting down Yugioh. Calling XCs basically means that they have to pass their turn. So obviously all of the Yugioh decks are going to be siding 3 copies of Crossout if they're not maining it already, as well as at least 1 copy of Dimensional Barrier, so they can play by activating it, Call Barrier. Same thing with Malice. You're going to be playing this with LANCEA, because LANCEA is a card that keeps that deck in check. So calling LANCEA. But at the same time, this card is also very, very good in a metagame with like 1 or 2 decks, because if you're playing a mirror match, you can obviously banish cards in your engine to stop your opponent, right? So this is another thing that makes Crossout a lot better than it already is. I think this card's gonna be everywhere, so you guys definitely have to be prepared for it. But there's actually another quick play spell card that I think is gonna be very, very relevant, and that's none other than Book of Eclipse. So this card flips all monsters on the field face down, and then during the end phase, if your opponent has any face down monsters, you flip them all up, they draw a card for each. Unfortunately, this means that it can be stopped by Ash Blossom, because all of the one effect includes the effect to draw at the end phase. But the reason this card is so good is because Yugioh actually relies on having their monsters face up to resolve the Yugioh Cross, which is the field spell. So typically a Yugioh end board is going to have the field spell up alongside a Yugioh Detonator, which is not a once per turn. This card can pop up to 2 or 3 times per turn, depending on how many materials it has attached to it. Not to mention, they're probably going to have another rank 4 XCs, whether that's already on the table, or if they just have 2 of the bodies, the level 4s on the field, waiting to resolve the effect of Hole Thruster in the graveyard to then XCs into something like Baguska during the opponent's turn. Book of Eclipse deals with both of these scenarios, because number one, it gets rid of the Detonator, it books it face down, so they can't respond or pop cards, and then it gets rid of the other rank 4 as well, so either a Baguska or like a Tornado Dragon, and on top of that, you stop Yugioh Cross from resolving, because they have to detach a material from a Yugioh XC's monster they control. Now, there is obviously a counterplay built into Yugioh. Typically, they use Dual Drive to search for Yugioh Cross and Yugioh Plugin, which is a quick play spell card that can reborn a rank 4 from their banish or their graveyard. So how it works with Book of Eclipse is, if we activate Book of Eclipse and they have Detonator, most of the time they're going to chain the effect of Detonator to pop itself, which means it goes to the graveyard. Then Book of Eclipse resolves, everything gets flipped face down. Now the Yugioh player can resolve the effect of their set Yugioh Plugin, bring back that Detonator, and attach a material to it, so they still get either one Yugioh Detonator pop or the Yugioh Cross being able to stop a monster effect. Now, the key thing about Book of Eclipse is that you basically traded not only with the rest of the Detonator pops, and then you also traded with the set Yugioh Plugin, and then on top of all that, they only have one single material attached to the Detonator, which means they have to choose between a Detonator pop or a Yugioh Cross negate for a monster, right? So they can only do one or the other in the ideal situation. So that's why Book of Eclipse is one card. You're basically dealing with like the whole Yugioh board and more, right? And the fact that this is a quick play spell card is also relevant in certain other matchups. You can disrupt your opponent in the worst case scenario, but against like Tempais, you might be able to survive a turn by activating this, because this doesn't target. Even if they try to Synchro Summon, it's still going to book everything down on resolution, right? So this is one of those cards that's always good. The only drawback is that it gets stopped by Ash Blossom, but I think for one card, if you're asking like one card to do this much in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh, it's very rare. There are no cards that can deal with any board all by itself. There's always a counterplay nowadays, right? So this card actually being able to do that much, I think is really, really powerful, and it's going to have a lot of utility. So definitely check out Book of Eclipse for this upcoming format. There's also another high impact spell card that everyone in the OCG is siding. So Ultimate Slayer is a card that's been around for some time, and now it's finally seeing the time to shine. So how this card works is you target a monster your opponent controls, and then you send the corresponding monster from your extra deck to the graveyard. So if they control an Xyz monster, you send an Xyz monster. If they control a Link, send a Fusion, so on and so forth. Now, why this card is so good against Yugioh is because when they end off with the Detonator board, you really have to get rid of the Detonator, because this card, it pops multiple cards. If you cannot deal with this, it's almost like Appaloosa. You're probably not going to win the game, because they get so much value off off of one card. So this is where Ultimate Slayer comes in. You can target the Detonator. Now, not only are they unable to respond with that monster's effect, meaning they're not going to be able to chain to pop the own Detonator to then bring it back to the Ryzeo plugin, but it also shuffles it back to the extra deck, so they're just out of the Ryzeo Detonator period for that turn. Now, you also send a card for a cost at the same time. So if you send Meteorologic Aggregator, you can actually give them a taste of their own medicine by then bouncing back the Detonator. Then on a new chain, you activate the Aggregator's effect and negate a face-up card on the field, so you can target the Ryzeo Cross, get rid of that. So you're getting a 2-for-1 trade off of this one card. And it's also okay against other decks. Against Malice, you might be able to play like Bucephalus and send Garura to get a free draw, right? So you're getting a free +1 there. I know there's some fusion strategies. Maybe you can play like Entis. Against Synchro strategies, you could also tech in a copy of Malong to get a bounce. But most importantly, we really care about the Xyz. This is why it's so good, is because it deals with the Ryzeo Detonator and also gets rid of the Ryzeo Cross at the same time. Now, the only jarring issue with this card is if people decide to play around it by playing a certain card in the extra deck called Starleech Photon Blast Dragon. This is a card that actually prevents your opponent from targeting monsters with 2,000 or more attack on the field, so that means you're not actually going to be able to target the Detonator with the Ultimate Slayer. However, in order for this card to actually protect against Ultimate Slayer, they have to have dual drive on the field as well with 2 or more materials, so the Photon Blast Dragon itself becomes 2,000 attack and cannot be targeted either. Otherwise, you can actually use Ultimate Slayer to target the Starleech Photon Blast Dragon. Then when you spin that back, you can use Aggregator's effect to negate the Detonator on the board. So it doesn't necessarily play around Ultimate Slayer fully, and their hand has to be absolutely crazy for them to summon both the Starleech Photon Blast Dragon plus the dual drive plus the Detonator through like any interruptions you already have. So that's why I think this card, Ultimate Slayer, is still really popular in the OCG metagame, and I expect it to be very popular in the TCG side deck as well. And then the last 2 cards I want to talk to you guys about are 2 existing hand traps. So Droll Knockbird and Nibiru the Primal Being. I think these cards are actually going to be somewhat good this format. Now, if you guys know me, you'll know that I hate Droll Knockbird. I've always been a hater of this card. I've never liked the fact that you have to hand rip yourself in order to impose a lingering condition, and half the time you just end up ripping that card for no reason. But this card might actually be good in this format specifically, because if you look at Ryzeo, we actually don't have full power Ryzeo, so to speak. We're not getting 7th Tachyon, which is like their main searcher card, which means the deck is really inconsistent. We have about 9 starters in the actual Ryzeo main deck engine, and then 3 copies of Bonfire, which gives us a total of 12. This means that a lot of Ryzeo players will be playing supplementary cards like Pot of Prosperity, Pot of Desires, and even cards like Small World in order to guarantee that they have a starter or an extender. With 12 starters, if you guys remember Cash Tier format, like the deck would brick a lot, right? Especially if one of your starters gets hand trapped, you just have to pass your turn because you have a lot of non-engine in your hand. So the fact that people will be playing pot cards in Small World means that Droll and Lockbird get so much value, being able to stop them from searching consecutively off of their other Ryzeo monsters, as well as stopping Ryzeo Dual Drive from searching Ryzeo Cross and Plugin or Hole Thruster. This is just absolutely crazy to think about. And on top of all that, all of the Ryzeo monsters basically search themselves. So if you hit an X Ryzeo searching Thode with this, you're still shutting off the Dual Drive, which is basically like trading an effect failure with the Dual Drive if you think about it, right? So in my opinion, I think Droll is actually really good against Ryzeos, especially when you pair it with other hand traps. Let's say that they do have the Ice Ryzeo and you stop that with a Veiler on top of the Droll, then you're probably in a really good spot. Now, Droll also has some marginal utility against the existing decks. Like we already know it's okay against Snake Eyes Fire King, against Tempai, even against Malice. If they're playing like Lure of Darkness, you can actually stop them and catch them where it hurts. And Nibiru is also very powerful against Malice because they special summon a bunch of times. Now, they obviously have ways to do it so they can play around it. Like they have to force you to nib at a certain point in their combo, which is easily made possible. And then if they have an extender like the field spell, they can still keep playing. But I still think it's really good. Same thing against Ryzeo. Now, Ryzeo can play around Nibiru if they start off with Dual Drive. But some people are playing around Veiler and Imperm by making like Detonator first so they can pop their own Dual Drive, or if they're making Starleech Photon Blast Dragon, same kind of deal. That plays into Nibiru because they're not able to establish the Ryzeo Cross before resolving the Dual Drive under 5 summons, which means that you're guaranteed to get some nib value. Now, even if they go off and lead with the Ryzeo Dual Drive, which I think is probably the correct play to play around Nibiru, you can still hit them with another hand trap. So anytime Nibiru is paired with another hand trap that prevents them from searching Ryzeo Cross, the Nibiru will clean up their entire board and get rid of the Detonator, whatever end board that they end up with. So I think Nibiru is actually really powerful in this format, and a lot of people are kind of underestimating it, but I expect to see it being a mainstay staple in the main deck again. So those were kind of the notes that I found just by testing the decks off in the past week or so. Guys, if you have any suggestions, also let us know in the comments below, because this is a really exciting format. New power level, new format, new cards, everything's changing. We're all excited. Let's see what happens, guys. Thanks a lot for tuning in. We'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.